So today we are going to be talking about sex and relationships and how they fit into children's ministry, or should we fit? The topic for today came out of a discussion we had at the Forge a while ago. By the way, if you want to come to the Forge, please book on. We just still have a few spaces left. The Forge is a conference for children's and youth and families leaders to all come together for 3 days and eat a lot of food and sharpen each other and talk. And it's great. You should come. And at the Forge, and we were talking about a whole bunch of issues, but it just sort of came up for me about sex and relationships, because I've been a youth pastor, and sex and relationships is something that you talk about a lot in youth. You have to do the talk, and then it comes up endlessly, and so it's something that sort of occupies the youth space, and often in children's ministry we wait for it to go to the youth space. But this week is Valentine's Day, and I thought actually asking the question, how do sex and relationships interact with our topics that we cover in children's ministry? Should we be talking about sex and children's ministry? And how do we help families do it? So that's the question of the day. If you have questions that you want me to attempt to answer, feel free. I basically picked this topic also because it's the seminar that I would want to, oops, I just hit you guys. It's the seminar that I would want to hear. And I haven't heard something on it. So I thought I'll put together my limited wisdom, and then you can all be super wise, and I can learn from you too. So if you have any wisdom or thoughts, feel free to add those in, because I'd love to hear them. So these are my thoughts on sex and relationships. I just also feel like I need to tell you this as people join. We recently tested with our children's ministry, with our Parenting for Faith stuff, because we're quite open group. I've had uterine cancer, we're quite open with discussing. And I kept typing things like, should we cover sex and relationships and things like that? And emails weren't going through. And it turns out that there's a filter on our emails at work, which means that we cannot type the word sex. So we now have to call it mush. And so we call it mush in all of our emails because sex won't go through our emails. So at some point I was just emailing them words, one word at a time, to see what words could go through and what words wouldn't. And I haven't been arrested so far, so it's good. Right, so here we go. My reflections on should we talk about sex and relationships within children's ministry, or are they just too young? And how should we engage with parents? So my first thoughts are this. It's tough. It's tough. And in my many years, I have waffled on this back and forth. And I think where I have landed is this. Parents' role is to have those conversations with their kids, and particularly with children. When parents choose to do that is very personal to them. It has a lot of factors coming into it, has cultural factors going into it, has the children's personality in it, it has what's going on in the family related to it. And so it's very much sitting in the parent role. Particularly in childhood. As it goes up into teenagehood, it sort of goes into the general sphere and we see them engaging more. But often we find children are still in that protected zone that their parents are deciding when they get more information on that. And so where I've landed in it is that there are two strands to how we respond as children's pastors and family pastors, and I have to say youth pastors. I'm going to be talking to you too about this. And I think there are things that are really helpful for us as children's ministry to push into. I think we do have a significant role in how to lay the foundations for sex and relationship talks. And I think there's an aspect of equipping parents and wading into how families are engaging with sex and relationships so that they feel equipped and confident to have those conversations at many stages throughout children's lives before they turn to youth. And then there's an aspect of working with the youth pastor to create a narrative that goes together. So what we're going to be talking about are those three different things. How can we lay the foundation within children's ministry for really laying the foundation for sex and relationships conversations? How can we encourage, support, and equip parents to be engaging with that stuff within their child's life, not just within their youth's life? And I feel like there's something on me. Sorry, it's freaking me out. I was like, if you see a spider, you better type in. Okay, just checking. If you see a spider, you let me know, because I need that. Right. And then how do we tie with youth ministry? So that's where we're headed. Please feel free to add your wisdom and questions as we go, and I'll be happy to answer questions as it pops up. So I think that within children's ministry and family ministry, we can be laying really important foundations so that when a conversation about sex and relationships comes up, we have laid almost biblical good soil for that to flourish. And there's 4 particular areas in my initial brainstorm. I could come up with way more probably later, but right now my 4 initial things that I think would be really healthy for us in children's ministry to lay for foundations for sex and relationships. The first one is we can be laying really good foundations in how we are engaging with the biblical stories of how we can engage with the biblical stories. Look, I'm even going to be little notes for you of the biblical stories of love and well, sex sometimes. There are some really violent stories in Scripture that are something that probably isn't appropriate for children, but I do think is in Scripture and is really interesting for us to engage with as they get through youth. So some of there are multiple rape stories in Scripture and sexual violence stories, and women being taken advantage of, and just how sex works. And I think there's loads of stuff in there that actually for older youth can be really interesting in wrestling with that. But it's not something I would suggest we jump in with a bunch of rape stories for 5-year-olds. What I'm talking about here is the sort of biblical stories of people getting together, those marriages, those falling in love stories, things like Isaac and Rebekah, things like Jacob and Rachel, the stories that we tend to actually cover in children's ministry. You know, the Abraham and Sarah. Often you hear these couple stories that we do tend to hit in children's ministry, and actually we can begin to look at those with our kids and begin to look at what those relationships looked like. For instance, with Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Rachel, actually, those stories aren't really great romance stories. They're not really something that you would want to lay as a foundation, on the whole, as a narrative for our kids. We don't want to be like, Jacob and Rachel, that's how you find a wife. Go someplace, like how they look, agree to work 7 years so that you could then hand over the woman. And then if you get tricked into marrying someone else, that's fine. You just need to work another 7 years because you really liked that one. Yeah, go for it. And by the way, Rachel never consented to that marriage, as far as we can tell. I mean, she got married, but we don't have any story of her being like, I love him so much. Those stories can come across as weird, and if we skip over them or just take them as rote, we're not taking a great opportunity to talk about them in a really interesting way. You know, when you look at Isaac and Rebekah, you know, he decided to get a wife. He sent a servant. That servant begged God to pick the right one. This woman came along and did the thing that he begged God for. He took her to her house and said, can I have this one for my thing? There are so many stories, but what we can do is say, where was God in that? Because that was an interesting way, and that's not how relationships work now. That's not how, you know, you find someone to marry. But at that time, that was, and where was God in that? And you can talk about who God was in that and how people's felt towards God in that. You can look at the women and admire their choices within that. If I'm repeating a bit of what I said in the podcast, this week's podcast for parents talks a bit about this. But these women didn't choose these marriages, and yet they entered into a situation that they weren't quite sure of, and they tried to make the best of it. And it was hard sometimes, and it was difficult, and they worked at it, and that was a really difficult journey for them. And sometimes in life you find yourself in a situation that you didn't choose and are stuck making the best of it. And what can we learn from those women who did that? We can take that opportunity to look at marriages around the world and how people do it, and how different cultures are, and what it means for those. There's so many different things that you can go to for that. And so instead of just skipping over biblical stories or going, oh, isn't that nice? He worked for 7 years to get Rachel because she was beautiful, and skipping over that, to really face down those questions of relationships as a useful tool. Sam Bailey jumped in with a question. When talking with children about Solomon, David, Jacob, who all have multiple wives and concubines, I get asked by the older children, 8 to 11-year-olds, why is it okay for them to have lots of relationships, but we can't have more than one relationship? How would you advise to tackle this question as children? Excellent question, Sam Bailey. I want to know how you answer it. Also, type it in. I want to hear your wisdom. That's really interesting. What I do sometimes is I look at the culture for them, and I say culture is really different. People lived in different countries and for different reasons and different things. At that time, which is thousands of years ago, at that time in that culture, one person would have multiple wives. Now, partially that probably, and this is me guessing, and it's really helpful to say what you're guessing and what you're not guessing. But you say, I'm guessing, when I look at it, back then women died a lot in childbirth. It was really, really difficult because we didn't have the same medical advances that we've had now. And giving birth is a really scary and dangerous thing, actually. And women died in childbirth a lot. And if they were going to have families that grew and sustained and continued, having one wife at a time could have been, I'm totally guessing here, a problem. Sometimes it's just how culture developed, where it used to be that the man was the most important, and the man was the most important, and women were sort of expendable. And so it was all about the man and what he needed and what he wanted. And if he wanted lots and lots of children so that he could have really big and powerful things, then he would have multiple wives so that he could have lots of children. Because back then it was really all about the man and not really about what the woman wanted. It could be that. It could be so many different reasons. But that was a really specific context for then. And now what we value in our culture is that one person can be with another person, and they can be the person that is the best minister of God to that person. And we say that dedicating ourselves and committing ourselves to one person shows us a bit of God's heart for us. It shows us that we can take care of someone and say, I'm not going to mess with your heart. I'm not going to hurt your heart. I'm not going to value other people. I am going to say you are the most important, and I'm going to sacrifice for you so that we together can experience something of God's sacrifice and God's connection with other people. That's how I would do it. And there's so many different routes you can go down. You can go down modern polygamy and what it is and how it affects people. You can go down the route of why only one person and the sacrifices that takes. You can have married couples come in and talk about monogamy and what that means for them and how they've seen God's heart and what it means to have someone who's committed to you for life and to have that for you. You can go down the route so many different ways. Let's see what Sam's reply was. Sam's reply is, I usually explain the culture of time was different and that men had more than one wife and concubines. We have different culture now and understands relationships differently now. Yes, you could do that. Also, if you want to go down Solomon and David, you can also talk about at the time, concubines and wives often weren't even for your typical marriage stuff in terms of sex. Often they were just treaties. And so, because Solomon had so many, couldn't possibly have gotten around that. But a lot of it was a sort of seal on the treaty that at the time women were used as almost promises. So yeah, let's do this, and to promise that I'm going to do it, I'm going to give you a woman, and that will remind you that you promised this and I promised this. And so it was a way of saying we're now family. And so some of these concubines and some of these wives were used more as political tools rather than actual marriages. It's a whole different way of looking at family, isn't it? When you look at how they had concubines and used them, and they still counted as me. And I look at the sadness with the kids of, what would have it felt like to be a concubine of a wife who is producing a child that the dad counts as his, but the wife is jealous. And how would that have felt in terms of feeling valued and loved, and how difficult that must have been. What an interesting and hard life to live, and why do you think God allowed that to happen? And if you really want to go down women's rights issues, you can look at the protections that afforded women in terms of having a place and having children, and there's loads of stuff. It's fascinating. So look at the biblical stories, engage with it, because these questions do come up. And Sam, I love that your kids were bold enough to ask. I think a lot of kids aren't bold enough to ask, and so they end up just dismissing parts of Scripture. And yet there's so much to discuss about envy and jealousy, and so much that we can learn from the women in these situations. So great question, Sam, and good wisdom too. Read what Sam says. The second thing that I think we can do is to lay a foundation for good sex and relationship conversations is to talk about how we guard our heart gardens. This is a concept that I tend to talk about with kids because I don't say the word sex, but what I'm laying, the foundations of when I'm talking about guarding our heart gardens is I basically say that our hearts are something that we're called to walk before God with pureness and real openness to God, and that it's our job to weed out anything that's growing in our heart garden that isn't of Him. And so when we have sin root in there, we can say, God, take this out of my heart and remove it, and I want to have a pure heart before you. And so when we talk about guarding our heart gardens, we open up a huge, beautiful conversation about things that can lay the foundation for things like porn. We can talk about when we let images into our head that cause fear in our hearts or worry in our hearts, or actually cause desires in our hearts to come up and take root, then we're not really guarding it. We're just letting anything grow in there. And it's our job to guard our hearts and minds from things that get in there. And when they get in there, it's our job to take them out, to ask God's forgiveness, to ask Him to take things out. And so we can talk about things like adverts. And when we watch adverts, we watch something and all of a sudden we want it. And then it makes us discontent with what we have. And it makes us go, oh, I want that more. And oh, wouldn't that be great if I have it? And oh, my toy's not as good. And actually it creates something in our heart that isn't right. It isn't contentment and gratefulness. It's wanting and desiring and envying, and it's not of God. And we let that into our hearts and minds, and we've got to root that one out. We can talk about lots of things that we let in. When it's a scary movie or something that you see that plants fear in there, and all of a sudden we're afraid at night times. We've got to figure out how to root it out, and we've got to ask God to pure it out. When we do guarding our heart gardens, it means it lays a really great foundation for then the porn conversation later, or for lust conversations later, because we've basically already laid the foundations of what are you letting grow in your heart, and how are you letting those things get in, and how do you deal with those. And so we've laid that foundation without having to go there. So it means when a parent talks about it, or when they get to youth and those youth talk about it, or even when they hear about things at school, they have already been primed for a really healthy way of engaging with things like that. I've got the, gosh, you're talking a long time, Rachel, warning. Thank you, Becky. Right, the third thing that we could talk about is romance. We talk about sex and relationships as if it's isolated. And actually, I think I circled it and now I regret it because I feel like it's messing with my thing. I'm going to have to go back and circle them all. Romance, I can't handle the discrepancy. Romance is a really interesting concept because it sort of lays down the path to sex and relationships, is this romance thing. And I find fascinating in our culture how much we let romance become a huge narrative in our kids' lives. If you think about most of the children's films that you watch, there usually is a romance that is central or even on the periphery of the stories that we have for children. You see, even in children's television episodes, children the characters liking each other or getting married or being in love. This concept of romance that goes through, and what romance gives you access to, is massive for kids. In order to get romance, which makes you joyful and happy and loved and valued, you have to be attractive enough that somebody sees you across the room and likes you. We train our kids that romance is about seeing someone from across the room and falling in love instantly. And then it's a path to getting together. When you finally get together, hurrah! That's the end of the story. And romance is so much more beautiful than what we give them, and so much more godly than what we give them. And I think we can tell romance stories in our children's ministries without needing to tell sex stories in our children's ministries, because romance is a beautiful thing. It's two people who see each other's character and heart and godliness and humor, and they feel drawn to each other, and they face problems, and they get married, and then after they get married, then it can be hard and it can be good, and then somebody gets sick, and then it's really hard, and it's a lifelong of people walking together. And I think it's great to be able to tell those stories of romance, whether it's your story, say if it's Valentine's Day week, you can sit down and say, you know what, I've never told you the story of how me and my partner got together. Or you can bring in some really old people who've been together for ages and say, what's your romance story? And have them tell the story of what they valued in each other and the God bit that they saw. And you can ask questions like, how has God spoken to you through your partner? You can tell those stories, facilitate those stories. You can tell stories that didn't end well or somebody died. You can tell stories of people finding each other and who God was in that. That is really significant. And most of the time that will happen in families, but it doesn't mean that we don't tell them, because there are some children who will come from broken families, who will come from single parent families, who come from blended families, and all of those have their own stories, and God is in the midst of all of those stories. And to begin to show that God is in the midst of our stories of getting together is a really important foundation, because otherwise we're saying God has nothing to do with romance except the Bible stories, which are complicated. And actually showing where God is in romance stories is really helpful. And it's something that we can invite families into and parents into, to share their stories and to talk about what that means for them. Fiona says you can testify to the power of talking about heart gardens. It's really cool, isn't it? It's really helpful. Right. So engage with romance stories and talk about how silly romance stories are. There are so many times where I pause. Aladdin, I couldn't even watch Aladdin with my kid, and I ended up telling children's ministry about this, because Aladdin, I sat down to watch Aladdin, and he got really upset, and I couldn't figure out why he was getting upset until I was sort of watching it with him, and he was upset because Jasmine had to get married because she's 21, that's the law, and everyone just accepted that that was the law, and he's like, why didn't the king change the law? And I was like, yeah. This whole story is because there was an unjust law that everyone's scrambling to win her, and she has to get married. Well, that was interesting. So why don't we call out these stories of why are we rooting for the prince and Cinderella when he never even knew her name or anything about her? Why would you pick someone based on just how they look in a dress? Anyways, there's some fun stuff. Right, the fourth thing is healthy relationships. Oh, we really got into this, healthy relationships. We really got into this with the Harvey Weinstein stuff and looking at what was coming out of Hollywood in terms of people misusing their power. And we began to sort of wrestle with this because there was such a misuse of power to manipulate people sexually. I really began to think about, and my team began to think about, how can we equip children and children's ministries and families to talk about and create foundations for people misusing their power sexually. And so Becky, I think, wrote this great thing. Becky, you might want to put up your article that you wrote. But I began to look at how can we look at manipulation? Because at the heart of some of what we want to talk about with kids when they get older, when they get to youth, is about power and manipulation. And that's centering around sex, because we get worried. We don't want our kids to get pressured into having sex or being taken advantage of sexually. We want them to make good, healthy choices about sex. And so a lot of that comes down to manipulation and power. And actually, there's loads in Scripture and loads of topics that we can wade into that lay a groundwork for having those conversations. So things like Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife, we often talk about it in terms of temptation. You know, there was this, Potiphar's wife, and there was him, and he was being desired, and he was like, no, I'm going to run away. And I'm sure temptation was a part of it. But also, she was his boss's wife, and she was basically threatening his job if he wouldn't do what she said. And that's huge. And kids experience that on the playground, not sexually, but they experience their friends going, if you don't do what I say, I'm not your friend anymore. How do you recognize when someone is using their power over you to try to manipulate you to do something that you don't like? And how do you respond to that? And you can talk about the consequence of that. He got accused of something, and he got thrown in jail for that. Should he have given in? It would have been easier. Would that have been right before God? You can have a huge conversation. You've never said the word sex, but you are laying a biblical foundation in there of how do you deal with manipulation. All of the stuff about envy and envying somebody else and wanting something for yourself. You can talk about Hosea and how, God had him marry someone who wasn't faithful to him so that he could experience a bit of God's heart, God wanting to have that exclusiveness with the people of Israel, and how we got a little snapshot of that. And that was tough, and Hosea did that to experience the love of that. You could talk about Samson and how he was being manipulated by I forgot her name. Samson and I don't know why it's gone from my head, but Delilah. Sorry. Delilah, and she was blatantly trying to use her relationship and what Samson wanted to get him to betray someone. Have you ever had someone try to manipulate that way? There are so many different things that you can look at in terms of ups and downs and people trying to use you, and how you stand up for that, and how do you balance what you really want with what God's asking for. There were so many different. Joseph had this great dream. If you wanted to look at not manipulation, but wanting something, but it not being time. Joseph had this dream from God that said, everyone's going to recognize you and bow down to you. And he decided to brag about those dreams and tell everybody about it because he wanted to have that now. And when he wanted to have something now that wasn't right, then his life went askew. And there are sometimes we want things that's just not the time for. And that's okay. We need to have the self-discipline to wait for it. You get the drift. There are so many different ways that we can build healthy relationship, biblical structures in. So even if we never said the word sex, but within our children's ministries, we began to look at these things. Becky says the Weinstein article is about whistleblowing primarily. But still, that's interesting too, about, someone was saying that there's a manipulation of power, and these people were standing up and saying, hey, that's not right. Well, actually, we need to be doing that for our friends and for ourselves. So there's things. So even if we did nothing but these 4 things, you'll be well on your way to creating a space that enables, when we start talking about sex and relationships, actually we will have been talking about the principles behind it for a really long time before we say the word sex. Now the second aspect of this is that's what we can do within our children's ministry to sort of create the foundations for that. The second thing we can do is partner with the youth and equip parents to do this stuff for themselves, because actually all the stuff that's out there, that talks about wisdom for parents is actually we need to start talking about it now. We need to be talking about it foundationally as children, as young people, as they get the facts about their bodies. We begin to teach them about, private parts are private, and what to do if someone makes you feel uncomfortable. We are already sort of laying the groundworks for those things in our homes. And one of the things that we can do in children's ministry is, while we're not reaching over parents and saying, I'll do it for you, what we are saying is, hey parents, I just want to remind you, it is godly and okay to talk about this stuff at home with your kids. And here's how. Because I find often parents don't do it, not because they don't think it's right that they should be doing it. It's usually because they don't know how, and so therefore sort of just don't. And so we can be the people who are actually like, okay, there are these books out here from a Christian perspective. There are some just neutral books out here. These are all of these. I'll tell you what, parents, on a Sunday morning before church, I'm going to have a, hey, come check out all of the sex books in my office. And you can go gather them and say, everyone bring the one that you have found helpful, and we'll just put it in a room, and I'll do a little bit of talking about how you might want to have the conversation and what are the strengths and weaknesses of these resources if you want to use that. You can host an evening that's really specifically how to have the talk. And you can bring in nurses, you can bring in your resources, you can share your wisdom, you can bring in experienced parents and say, look, the talk is important, and you're going to be having it multiple times throughout childhood. It's not just one talk. It's the talk over and over and over again. And this is how you might want to shape it. You can tell your stories about it, but to put it in front of parents and say, don't be scared by this. This is something you can totally do no matter what your experience have been. And this is how some people have found it useful and helpful, is a big service to parents. We are currently researching a bunch of books. And so when we get that done, we can give it to you. So you don't have to do all the research. I can give it to you, and then you can equip your parents to do that. And if you have any recommendations of books or things that would be really useful to pass to parents, please post it on here on this page so that we can share that wisdom, because there's some really great stuff out there. Another thing that you can do is just send them reminders. Hey, parents, your kid is 5 and about to go to school. And before they encounter everybody else's wisdom on the topic of their bodies and what you want, you might want to have what your privates look like and what other people's privates. You might want to have that conversation. Here's a chart. Here's how somebody wise has talked about it before. Because, we as parents always want to be the first one who explains it. And it's a really powerful thing to be able to explain that to your kids. And we can just begin to give them wisdom on that. Another thing that you might want to do as kids get older is to do some joint stuff with youth, because they're beginning to transition. And when the kids get older, what you talk about is important. And you may want to have a porn, masturbation, and all things awkward evening with parents, because in my experience, when we create space for parents to talk about it, what we get is all of their fears and their worries, and they need to start talking about it usually before they actually get there. And so if we start gathering the parents of 8, 9, 10, 11 in there to talk about, how do you talk about porn with this? I mean, there was a statistic, I can't remember the statistic, that an enormous amount of 10-year-olds have seen pornography. If you know that statistic, it'd be great if you could type it in, because it's been a recent statistic and I don't want to guess at it, but it was big. It was definitely the majority of children by 9 or 10 have seen pornography. Not necessarily that they've gotten addicted to it, but they have seen it. And so we know from some statistics that our kids are beginning to engage with these things. And so if we want to give our parents a heads up of this is coming, and this is how you might want to talk about it, and this is how you might want to get comfortable with it, and you'll figure out, you figure out how it'll work best for your kid. I'm not going to make the decision, but I can give you everything you need to feel confident to have that conversation. 50% is the statistic that Becky has sent me, 50% of kids. So it's definitely at least half then have seen it. And that's a big statistic for parents to not know about or not be able to equip their kids. So if we can get together with the youth pastor and him say, this is what I'm reading with all the youth stuff. This is how youth parents have found it helpful. We can bring youth parents in and say, this is when I first had the conversation. This is how I did it. This is, to help parents think through, what do they theologically think about masturbation? How do they want to explain porn? All of that stuff, to just give parents a space to talk it out and to try it and say what worked and what didn't work, and to give them, to be the church that says, we are not afraid of this. You as parents can handle this, and this is how we're going to help you. We're going to give you access to knowledge. We're going to give you access to other parents, and we're going to help you find what's right for your kid. Sarah Hogman says the NSPCC Pants campaign is great for personal safety. They do little packs for kids you can order in the post with coloring, etc. We love doing them together at home. How great would it be to say, hey parents, just want to let you know NSPCC has these free packs that you might want to do at home about don't let anyone under your pants type thing. And it's really helpful and can open up some really interesting conversations at home. Feel free to do it. Here's the link. And we can be that person who's saying nothing is taboo, and I can help you do that. Sam Bailey has a question. There are different theological arguments around sex and when is appropriate. How would you recommend we teach parents the arguments around sex and when it's appropriate in a balanced way without making parents feel judged? Really great question. There are differences out there. One is to empower parents themselves. When I tend to approach parents, I tend not to say, this is the thing that you must do. This is the general, everybody should do this wisdom. And if you're not doing it, I'd suggest you do it. What I tend to say is there's lots of different things out there. Some have this argument, some have this argument. But actually, my question to you is, what is your kid ready for? What do you want to prepare them for? And when do you feel it's right for your particular child? And then enabling other people's voices to come out. So I can say, so personally, me, with my particular kid, I wanted to lay the foundation super early. Partially, I got uterine cancer when he was 5. So we were talking a lot about vaginas and all sorts of things. And so it was just natural we were drawing uteruses on walls. And so for us, the talk about the anatomy was quite a natural part of, I didn't get him when he was 5, 7. Well, when he was young. So we were very comfortable with all the anatomy. But even before then, when I was 5, I was really aware he was going to a school and I couldn't control what other people's had on screens, because I saw some of the kids walking around with screens, and I know children, so I know if they see a funny naked photo of somebody on a screen, they're going to show people. And so I was like, I have a 5-year-old. He's a very sensible 5-year-old, so he's about to go to school. And so I started laying the foundation for porn when he was 5, and I just said sometimes people let people take pictures of them that are naked. To be like, hey, look at me, and other people like looking at them. And that's just not something we do, because we protect people's modesty. And actually, it's not our job to have pictures of other people's privates in our head. Absolutely not. And so if someone tries to show you their privates in person, if somebody tries to show you their privates on a picture, what we do is we just close our eyes and say, no, thank you, and we walk away, because actually it's our job to guard ourselves. So that those pictures don't get into our hearts, so that we don't begin to think those are funny and seek them out. We just protect our brains, and we protect the other people, because we don't know the circumstances of that picture, and they may not want that picture out there, so we just protect our eyes. And I just gave that foundation for a 5-year-old. You may disagree with it, and that's what I tell parents. You may disagree with what I'm saying. That's okay, but at least if you disagree, it's because then you know what you do think, and this is a very personal thing of what you do. So I can tell my stories of what I've done. I can empower other parents. I'll empower another parent who says, I totally disagree. Actually, I don't think you should talk about it until they're 10. You go, fascinating. How did you make that decision? And they can talk about that, because what we're really looking for is not, this is the right way to do it. What we're saying is, as parents, it's a question for you to answer for yourself. And my job is to help you figure out what's right for you, because you're the expert in your kids. Sam also said there's a start where the average age of first exposure to porn is around 7 to 9 years old. Yes, the Naked Truth Project do a lot with regards to pornography, and he gave the Naked Truth Project. There's so much out there that we know about, that Sam knows about, that Sarah knows about, that we can facilitate with our parents, a really great conversation. Sarah says that we also use the NSPC Pants video as part of potty training. It's a ridiculously catchy song. You know, you never know what you may use it for. But when we marry what we're doing with children's ministry and giving those resources to parents. You know, what we talk about in the book, It Takes a Church to Raise a Parent, when we're saying, you know, we're communicating and we're inviting parents in and we are enabling questions to go home about all of these biblical stories, about guarding our heart gardens, about romance, about healthy relationships. When we send home questions for kids to ask parents about, when we put on special mornings where we talk about manipulation and invite parents in, when we are doing all of those tools that we have in that chapter, and It Takes a Church to Raise a Parent, to facilitate parents becoming powerful within their kids' lives spiritually, and how we as children's ministry can do that. When we hit all of these topics in what we're doing, we are inviting parents in to be able to hook into all of these foundations that we are building and that they can build themselves, and we begin an excellent partnership of the two. So, yes, there's been some excellent wisdom from Sam and Sarah, and I'm sure others as well. Unless there's any other questions, we've been going for 45 minutes. Becky, is there anything else that we need to look at before we go? I'd suggest that you keep posting on this page any other resources or wisdom that you have, because I think it's something that we all do. I in no way am saying that I am the expert in this, but this, in my experience, is what's been helpful. And you will have your own experiences that will be incredibly helpful to others as well. But let's not make anything taboo. Let us empower parents to do this. And let's make our children's ministry places where we are doing that. So then when we then partner with the youth pastor, he then can share with parents, this is what we're doing next. This is what's coming up. What do you need from us? What wisdom do you need? You can bring in other parents. I did one with a youth pastor where we brought in other parents who just were to talk about how do they, help make decisions about all of this sex stuff with their teenagers and how they cope with that. And when we partner with that youth ministry, like we talked about before in joint custody, we become, for parents, an incredible strengthening and encouragement for them. So as we're hitting Valentine's Day this week, be encouraged, be bold to wade into these issues, because it's a very powerful thing we do. So I actually want to pray for you. God, I thank you for sex and relationships, and that you yourself, there's nothing that is hidden from you, and there's nothing that is too embarrassing to talk about with you. And I thank you that you have called us to walk into these really vulnerable places with parents. And so, God, I pray for everybody who is listening to this, that you would equip and empower them and strengthen them to be bold, to lay beautiful foundations within their children's ministry, and that you would empower them to equip and inspire and support parents as they decide for themselves what is right for the children that are in their lives. Thank you that you have called us to this place, and thank you for every child and parent that is within our ministry. In Jesus' name, amen. Love you guys. Looking forward to it. If you want to come to the Forge, please come. We have spaces. You will be connected. You will enjoy each other, and you'll learn so much just from the sharpening of other children's pastors and family pastors and youth pastors. So please do come. And I can't remember the topic for next month, but I will see you next month. Next Facebook Live, Becky rescued me. Tuesday, the 12th of March. Oh, that's right. We're doing it on the 12th, not the 13th. Warning, 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 because it's the Forge next month. And so we're doing it on the Tuesday instead of the Wednesday. I know that totally messes with our 10th thing. I apologize. We'll try to let you know. But we're going to have children's pastors from all over the country there. And rather than me talk at you, we're going to sort of be pulling out some really interesting stuff that everyone's been sharing. The Forge is about people wrestling together with ideas and getting out of each other interesting ideas of what's going to happen. And we're going to pull out some of those really interesting learning for you and cater it, because we got a lot of people who are wise with me. So either come to the Forge or be here Tuesday, the 12th of March. So I love you. I pray for you, and take care. Bye. Oh, and